Alright, so this is the second time doing this. Because YouTube was all, oh, something's happened. And I'm like, alright, I'll click buttons. Click, click, click. And then it was all, oh, we erased your video. And I'm like, damn it. Anyway, so I ended the last clip, well, the last clip, by saying that when we think about experimental philosophy, right, which is another way in which science and philosophy can sort of, help one another out, it said that there are two ways, or two programs, right, or sort of two projects, right. One is a positive project, and another is a negative project. So let's talk briefly about the positive project. So, and by the way, I want to illustrate both of these things with some work done with the trolley example, right? Remember, you've got, the one, you either kill the 5 or kill the 1, you have to choose. So, tilt this down just a hair. Thank you. So, with the positive project of experimental philosophy, what we do is we use some scientific methods, right, specifically from the social sciences, to find out the contents of our philosophical concepts, right? And sometimes these things are interesting, sometimes they're flattering, sometimes they make us sad in our bellies. So, what's an example? Well, one example is actually done by a high school student, actually, in New York. Her name is Tiffany Sun. And she learned about the trolley thought experiment through like a summer gifted and talented program. And she wondered what effect changing certain features of the one person would do to subjects' judgments about killing that one person. So what she did is she set up the thought experiment, right? You've got the 5 people on the one track, and you've got the runaway trolley, and you've got the one person on the other track. And you can either do nothing, let the 5 die, or you can do something, and when the one person dies. And the one person, to keep this element of the project sort of consistent, she said it was a woman, and she varied 3 features of that one woman, right? So whether she was disabled, her race, so whether she was white or non-white, it doesn't specify, at least not that I saw, whether it was black or Latino, or Latina, or Hispanic. And finally, socioeconomic status. And what she found is that people were more likely to sacrifice the one person if she was disabled, or non-white, or of low socioeconomic status, right? So that is to say that part of our moral concept of a sacrificable person, if you want to put it that way, is that somebody is more sacrificable, more willing to be killed to save a number of other people, if that one person is disabled, if they tend to be on the poor end of the spectrum, or if they tend to be, well, not white, right, non-Caucasian. So, how is this an instance of the positive project? Well, it's an instance of the positive project because we're learning something about a moral concept, right, that we couldn't have learned otherwise, or rather that wasn't obvious to us otherwise. Right, so we have this moral concept of, I guess you could put it rather clunkily as sacrificability, right, somebody who is able to be sacrificed for the good of others. And so it turns out that part of our concept of a sacrificable person is somebody who tends to be disabled, poor, or, well, not white. So clearly this isn't flattering, right? This is terrible, terrible news. But nonetheless, we're finding out through social science, through social scientific methodology, part of the contents of one of our moral concepts. And so it's not saying it's good or it's bad, it's just saying that we can use some scientific methodologies to discover what's in our moral concepts that perhaps weren't obvious to us in the first go-round. The negative project, on the other hand, looks to, I guess, undermine beliefs about philosophical intuitions. So, again, so here's another one with the trolley experiment. So this one comes from 2 philosophers, Eric Schwitzgebel and Thierry Kouchner. And so what they did is they used the trolley thought experiment. They didn't really deal with the content of it, but they were interested in testing beliefs about philosophers' rationality, right? So philosophers, we think a lot. It's kind of our thing. And so part of the belief is that we're really good at thinking, right? That we get down to essential elements of problems that ordinary folks just can't get at, I suppose, or something like that. Like we can sort out extraneous details to get at, like, the heart of a problem. And so Schwitzgebel and Cushman put this to the test. And so they took a bunch of philosophers and they systematically varied the way in which the problem was presented. They used what's called in psychology a framing effect, right? Putting the same thing but in a different way, right? So, for example, we can frame, we can frame things as wins or losses, right? Or probability of a win versus probability of a loss, right? And so you're more likely to engage in risky behavior if we frame it as a probability of a win rather than as a probability of a loss, right? Something along those lines, right? In case you're interested, they're called framing effects. The psychologists Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky were some of the first to discover this. So what these two guys, Schwitzgebel and Cushman, found out is that philosophers are subject to framing effects just like anybody else. So in this case, the belief is that philosophers have a kind of privileged rationality, right? That we have a kind of access to the heart of a problem that non-philosophers simply don't have access to, right? But what it turns out is that we really don't. Is that we're subject to common psychological effects just like any other person. So how is this an instance of the negative project? Well, it's an instance of the negative project because we have this belief that philosophers are particularly rational or exemplary thinkers or reasoners. And this study shows us that we're not, that we're subject to a lot of biases and psychological effects that non-philosophers are subject to as well. So in that case, right, so in this case, we see the negative project of experimental philosophy, right, where we use methodologies in the social sciences to, in a sense, undercut or dismantle certain intuitions. Now, this brings up interesting questions for us. So one is kind of mentioned, is tangentially mentioned by Stitch and Tobiah in that paper on experimental philosophy. They're considering it with respect to the Gettier problem, right? The Gettier problem can be stated pretty simply like this. Imagine that you think it's 12 o'clock, and imagine that it really is 12 o'clock. And imagine that you think it's 12 o'clock because you look at the clock on the wall says that it's noon. But imagine that unknown to you, the clock stopped working the instant before you looked at it. So what you're looking at is a broken clock, but you don't know that it's a broken clock, and that broken clock just happens to show the right time. So, the question is, do you know that it's noon? Now, most philosophers say you don't, right? That you just happen to look at the clock at the right time, you got lucky looking at the clock at noon, and so your belief that it's noon is a true belief, but you don't really know that it's noon because you don't have a good reason for believing that it's noon, right? Your belief is unjustified. East Asians, on the other hand, are fully willing to say that you know that it's noon, right? That even though the clock is broken and you just happen to look at it at the right time, you still know that it's noon. And so this goes down to, the explanation goes down to anthropological consideration or cultural considerations on individualist versus collectivist cultures, right? So let's set aside those anthropological details and just focus on this. East Asian intuitions say you know that it's noon. Western intuitions say you don't. So what do we do in this case? So do we just sort of say, well, both groups are right in their own way? Do we say one has to be right and the other has to be wrong? Do we say maybe neither of them is right? Maybe we could even say that it's just a bad question to begin with, to talk about who's right in this instance. But in any case, no matter how you want to go, right, which one of those questions you go with, we're dealing with interesting philosophical questions that emerge from the negative or the destructive program of experimental philosophy. So experimental philosophy, again, just to recap this little bit, has a positive and a negative branch, right? The positive tries to unpack using social scientific methods some of our philosophical concepts. The negative project, or the destructive project, tries to show that our philosophical intuitions aren't widespread, right? That they don't sort of go all over the world, or even, in a lot of cases, across socioeconomic statuses. So, to recap these last two video lectures, we can think about the relationship between science and philosophy in three ways. The first way is that scientific findings inform our philosophical investigations, right? And that has to do with the teeth and the pencil and the car. The second one is that scientific findings answer philosophical questions, right? And so that was the case with the brain, the brain and the mind, right? That any mind questions we have are ultimately going to be answered by the neurosciences, right? Because there's no such thing as mind. Psychology is a bad science. We'll be talking about that more later. But the important point is that scientific answers are given to philosophical questions. The third one is that we use not scientific answers, but scientific methodologies to derive answers to philosophical questions, or to help undercut or undermine philosophical beliefs. Now, I haven't said anything so far about that short piece that you read on brain pickings, the review of the book by Dorian Sagan. So, let me close by saying this. I like that piece because it shows how science and philosophy can together be really fruitful. And like I mentioned in the last video, there are some scientists lately who have shunned philosophy, right? Neil deGrasse Tyson, Stephen Hawking are two of the big names. I mean, but you can find other people, right? Like Richard Dawkins doesn't seem to have much time for philosophy. Christopher Hitchens, well, when he was alive, didn't seem to have too much time for philosophy. No, is that right? No, sorry. Sam Harris. Sam Harris doesn't seem to have too much time for philosophy. But what that review gives us is it gives us a vision of science and philosophy in which they're kind of synergistic, right, where they work with one another. So the sciences, to proceed, have to have really focused, very bounded explanations, right? I mean, that's the way you make some progress in the sciences, right? You can't make these grand sweeping claims, but rather you have to come up with specific answers to specific questions. Philosophy, on the other hand, again, this is something of a generalization, as is the thing about science, but it'll do for right now. Philosophy tends to look at a much bigger picture, right? That they're not just interested in one or two very tightly focused questions, but they're interested in how the answers to those questions can get integrated into a larger understanding of ourselves, of reality, and of the nature of things, really. So these two things can work, right? These two projects can work together. They complement one another, in that the sciences can help concretize or make much more specific philosophical ideas that we already hold, right? And I take it that that's what helps, the first way that we talked about science and philosophy, that exemplifies that, right? That scientific findings inform our philosophical investigations. But what the Brain Pickings review gives us is influence in the other direction as well, namely that philosophy can have an influence on the sciences, right? That they can help frame scientific questions and give a larger picture, or provide the larger picture for what scientists are doing, for what scientific findings tell us about ourselves, about the nature of the world and reality. So, I think that there are a number of ways in which science and philosophy can work together. And as we're going to see as the summer term goes on, the way in which we think about the relationship between science and philosophy will shape how we do philosophy.